Aren't you fed up of feeling the same self-destructive emotions, falling prey to the same bad habits, constantly relying on external things like screens, shopping, food and cheap dopamine to change how you feel on the inside? And aren't you fed up of feeling as if change is such an impossible task, always just outside of your capability? Well, good, because so was I, until I read Dr. Joe Dispenza's groundbreaking book, Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself, which we're going to deep dive into right now. But before we do so, here's the loop you're likely stuck in right now. By continuously thinking the same thoughts, you make the same choices, meaning your behaviour stays the same, resulting in you having the same experiences that spark the same emotions, that trigger the same thoughts that started the loop in the first place. As a whole, everything stays the same because you're staying the same, meaning your neurochemistry and your gene expressions also stay the same. So the main way to bypass this whole system and to kickstart behaviour change is to simply learn new information. Because by acquiring new knowledge, you prepare your brain to have a new experience. So it becomes new thoughts, trigger new choices, result in new behaviours, spark new experiences, spark you to feel new emotions that trigger those thoughts again. Your brain, when it learns, rewires itself to accommodate for that information. The analogy here is to think about it in terms of computer software. You're going to first become so consciously aware of your old software that is currently running, and then you're going to update it with fresh, new software. So that's the big kicker here. 90% of behaviour change is learning new information, which you're going to do throughout this video. The last 10% are the few tweaks here and there that I'll teach you how to do. But more specifically, there's going to be an attitude we're going to move away from and an attitude we're going to move towards. The current attitude that we're going to move away from is, I feel doomed to repeat the same emotional reactions and rely on external things to change my internal state. The attitude we're going to move towards is, I can turn on desired states at will as a creator and rise above thought, feeling loops. Just quickly, give me 20 seconds to explain the boring stuff. The structure of this video will be, first of all, we're going to cover the enemy and the hero. We're going to paint an even clearer picture of these two attitudes. Then, the most important point, we're going to cover how thought, feeling loops manifest and what they are in the first place. This is the most important part because, as we always say on this channel, to understand the problem is to solve it. Hence, we're going to get into the psychology and the neuroscience of how these loops manifest and how to break them. Then we're going to cover coherence, paint a picture of the ideal state we're aiming for, and then we're going to cover the final part by moving away from the understanding to really get into the practicalities and the open questions we're going to question of ourselves to make this change that we want to make stick. This is an interactive video. Get your pens out, get your notebooks, get your favourite clothes on. But first, before we get into point number one, and in order to lay a real solid foundation for everything that is going to come after, I just want to highlight one analogy of behaviour change. A useful analogy for behaviour change is gardening when we look at it through the lens of cultivation, because you're going to be cultivating a new self in replacement of your old self. Interestingly enough, you can consider a lot of what we're going to cover throughout this video as a form of meditation. And the Tibetan word for meditation, when translated into English, is translated as to become familiar with, which highlights our first point of call in our method of behaviour change, which is you need to first observe your old self. Because in the same way as when you're gardening, not sure how experienced you are with gardening, me not so much, but still, logic applies. When you are gardening in real life and you want to add new soil to your garden, you don't just chuck a load of new soil on top of the old soil. You have to churn up the old soil in order for the new soil to mix in with the old soil, and second of all, for there to be enough space for the new soil to slot into. So too, you don't just think about the ideal version of yourself that you want to morph into when it comes to behaviour change. No, because first there are things you have to become so consciously aware of in order for them to not slip into unconsciousness anymore. Those things we're talking about in your garden of behaviour change are, first of all, the big boys, such as the rocks, which are your personal limitations. And then, of course, we have last season's plants, which are your old beliefs, actions, behaviours, thoughts, emotions, cognitive algorithms, emotional algorithms, which we're going to deep dive into in about 5 or 10 minutes' time. We have the weeds that are currently in your garden, which are your unconscious attitudes and beliefs. So as we've mentioned, you have to become so consciously aware of what is in your garden first of all, for you to understand where you're going to be able to clear the space in order for new things and growth to sprout. So your garden will then look somewhat like this. Just thought of an analogy. In terms of observing your old self, think about it as if you're an athlete who is filming themselves while training to then watch the video back after to see what's going on and what needs changing. Anyway, the upgraded garden is comprised of a few new elements. Remember, now we're talking about stage number 2, which is cultivating your new self. In the new garden, you have fertilizer, which means that when you fertilise the fruit, that represents you falling in love with this new version of yourself. The safety net around the new season's plants, which are your new algorithms, thought, feeling loops, actions, behaviours and beliefs that you have cultivated, is you emotionally rejoicing in the new version of yourself. The diverse fruits that you yield now and in the future is a consequence of the creativity you express in the creation of your new self. And then you sowing seeds in your garden is you learning and acquiring new knowledge. And lastly, sorry, I didn't have a yellow or orange pen for the sun. It has to be a red sun. The sunlight and water fueling the production in your garden is your conscious attention that you apply to your cultivation and observations, as well as your dreams that you hold steadfast in your mind. All of this analogy of gardening highlights our main neuroscientific principle of this video, which is, if you don't use it, you lose it. To whet your appetite, if you understand what I'm about to explain, you understand a fundamental neuroscientific principle by which your brain operates, meaning you can learn anything and change any behaviour. Not to give myself too high of an expectation, but going back to the analogy of gardening, when you clear your garden of the weeds, last season's plants, or you chop, cut and get rid of things that you don't want in your garden, the technical term for that is known as pruning. Let's say you have a branch and you want to chop the leaves off so new leaves can grow. Chop the leaves off, you're pruning. But the cool thing is, your brain is pruning all of the time. Because within your brain, there are billions of these little structures or nerve cells called neurons. You've probably heard of them before. And very much like a very bushy branch or a very bushy tree, extended from their main cell in the centre, they have loads of these branch-like structures reaching out to other neurons in order to carry electrochemical signals along their branches, so particular messages can be communicated to other neurons. And depending on what those messages are, that determines what you think and how you feel at any given moment in time. And the second neuroscientific principle here is neurons that fire at the same time will wire themselves together, mainly because it's efficient. Your brain had a conversation with itself one day and thought, hold on, we've got a load of neurons sparking themselves at the same time in response to this thought, feeling, or external thing from our environment, why not just clump them all together in a pathway, very much like a global airport network, so we can save time, and that reaction in response to this stimulus can be performed much easier. So the more that pathway is activated, the more you will carry out whatever that pathway wants you to do, be it a behaviour, a thought-feeling loop, or a cognitive response. So the pathway being formed is known as a process of tuning, the opposite of pruning. But going back to how your brain prunes, if the pathway is not activated, or is activated very infrequently, then the pathway gradually fades. I'm making it out as if it's a very sad thing, and the pathway cannot live anymore, because your brain thinks, oh well, this pathway isn't being used. Let's just get rid of it, so we can save energy, time, and we can clear space for new pathways to be formed. So if you starve out the pathways of your old self by first becoming aware of them and then refusing to fall into the slippery slope of unconscious repetition, and you instead upgrade that old software with cultivating new pathways by means of tuning, oh, new pathways have been formed. Oh, we're practicing a new behaviour, which means that we're forming new experiences, meaning we now feel new emotions, and new pathways are being formed which spark new neurons, and everyone is happy in the brain pathway realm. And you repeat that pathway again and again and again, so it becomes an automatic unconscious experience. Then you have conditioned your brain and body to a completely new way of being. And just like we covered a few minutes ago, you cannot just first think about your ideal self that you want to morph into before you prune your garden of the pathways that are now no longer serving you. You cannot just first think positive thoughts and expect brilliant things to happen in your life, because as long as your brain, or your mind, which is your brain in action, as long as your mind and body are out of unison, then you're not going to be able to form these new pathways in a repetitive manner so that they stick. You have to get both brain and body in unison for you to break the habit of being yourself, as we are going to really deep dive into in the thought feeling loop section, which is going to be awesome. But another way to think about tuning and pruning is if you stopped speaking your native language for the next 20 years, you would gradually forget it, because your brain would be like, oh, this pathway's not being used, let's just forget about it. It's exactly what happened to me when I was learning Polish. I just forgot about it and my brain was like, not good anymore. Okay, before we get into point number 1, there's just a few sentences I want to hit you with. If you change your brain, you change your mind. If you change your mind, you change your brain. That might not make sense right now, but in a few points' time, you'll know exactly what that means. And lastly, to experience change, observe a new outcome with a new mind. Let's get into point number 1. By the way, throughout the video, in order to give your brain some rest from all of the information and knowledge, I'm going to leave the parts sometimes when I'm rubbing the things off the board, so you can have a brain restoration time. Okay, point number 1, the enemy and the hero. Let's diagnose the problem. There's a lot of stuff on the board, but don't worry, I'm going to show you where to look as we go through all of the points. And don't worry about not being able to see this part yet. Consider it as an unlocked character from the sun. You can tell how long I've been waiting for the sun to move across the whiteboard for the last 3 hours of my life, when all I wanted to do was record a video. Anyway, first of all, the enemy we're up against here is the version of yourself that relies on the external world in order to fuel your emotional addictions, all of which creates an illusion. And the illusion is You run and you run and you run and you busy yourself and you occupy your mind with the external world, be it through food, TV, entertainment, screens, shopping or gossip, in order to avoid the emptiness and emotional distress you feel within. And you continue this illusion until one day you realise it's an illusion you've been living, and you go into this stage, which is where you likely are now, where you grow fed up. You become fed up of living through this illusion and you reason, why do I have to continuously be a slave to external things in order for me to feel a certain way? Surely there's another way for me to feel the solace and serenity and the creatorship that I want to feel in my life. Essentially, you become fed up with presenting a facade and a false identity to the world that is incongruent and out of alignment with how you feel inside. Being fed up is the first stage. That's great. That's where you likely are now. But the reason why sometimes you stay in this fed up stage is, of course, you lack the knowledge of what to do next. In the words of Joe Dispenza, when the same people and things in our lives create the same emotions, and the feeling we are trying to make go away no longer changes, we look for new people and things, or try going to new places in an attempt to change how we feel emotionally. If that doesn't work, we go to the next level, addictions. The analogy I want to highlight here, if we go to the top left, think about it in the lens of two hands. Yes, these are hands. Took me about 30 minutes to draw these and they're still not good. The upper hand is how you appear to the world. So again, this is the illusion you live through, the facade you present, the identity you would like to project to the world that is out of alignment with what's going on inside of you. This is where you operate from those low vibrational, negative emotional states, such as anger, guilt, shame, depression, fear, unworthiness, distress. The other hand, though, is who you really are. And this is the ideal we're striving for. We're striving for an inner coherence between what's going on inside and what you project to the external world. This is your ideal self and that true congruent alignment of who you are. This is where you operate from those higher vibrational emotional states, such as love, serenity, peace, abundance, creatorship, and solace. More love, I was going to say, but already said that. And we're going to deep dive into this in the next section, but to give you a little gush on it now, sorry, that was inappropriate, but when you reach the stage of being fed up, you become fed up because you see through the illusion. However, what you don't realise is by becoming fed up and rising above the illusion slightly, you now start to unmemorize past emotional responses, meaning that you liberate dormant energy that you can now channel towards cultivating new, desirable, positive emotional states. So take this moment to consider your answers to these questions to get the ball rolling. Okay, throughout this video so far, you might have had an understanding of an emotional state or an emotional mechanism that is holding you back in life at this moment in time. Maybe it's sparked by a thought, coupled by an emotion, maybe it's guilt, shame, depression, what have you. Keep that algorithm in mind that you would like to change and consider these. When you're feeling that state, is this really who I am? Is this really who I want to be? And what energy from past experiences, in the form of limited emotions, am I holding on to that reinforces my past identity and emotionally attaches me to my current circumstances? could I use this same energy and transform it into an elevated state from which to create a new and different outcome? So before we move on to the hero part, and just to give you a real feeling for what we're talking about here, I want to do an imagination exercise with you. It's going to seem a bit weird, but stay with me. Close your eyes. And I want you to imagine you're sat in the middle of a dark room. But gradually you hear the walls are slowly closing in on you as you're sat stuck to your position in the middle of the room. And you're feeling frightened now because you're wondering how you're going to escape this room and avoid being squished by these walls. Slowly, the walls are edging closer and closer towards you. Your fear is increasing until you see a beam of bright light in front of you and a door is opened. So as the walls are closing in, getting closer and closer, you now stand up and walk through that new open door and you appear into a new room that is bigger, more expansive and brightly coloured. So now you're stood in this new room and you're feeling happy and relieved at having escaped this old room. So now you're stood in the middle of this new expansive room, but then you turn around to see what happened to the old room and you see that the walls have completely closed in on themselves, making it impossible for you to walk back through that door. Now you can open your eyes, if you did close your eyes. That feeling of walking through that door is the same feeling you'll experience by cultivating your new self, which highlights the hero of our story, which is that version of yourself that has chosen to cultivate your desired chemical, emotional and cognitive states at will as a creator rather than a subservient to external cues. You no longer rely on external cues or solutions to fix an internal problem. Instead, you cultivate your internal state to then project that out into the world for a state of congruence and alignment. Who you are on the inside is exactly how you appear to the external world. Specifically, the hero version of yourself is equipped with higher level knowledge, which you then use to govern your experience, and that experience, through repetition, becomes memorized knowledge. And what is memorized knowledge? It is wisdom. As the quote from Michel Montaigne, the French philosopher, goes, "The surest sign of wisdom is constant cheerfulness." Love that quote. The physics that the hero you operates from isn't cause and effect. Cause and effect is what the enemy you relies on. Because cause and effect physics relies on something in your external environment producing an effect internally. The hero you operates from causing an effect down here, which means internal shift, external shift. Rather than external absorption, internal shift. As the saying goes, life is a state of mind. So essentially what we're talking about here is we're closing the gap between the enemy you and the hero you. So you can operate from this level of creatorship most of, if not all of the time. Because most people, of course, rely on external factors to produce a cause and effect in their internal environment. Meaning that 90% of the time, they are operating from survival emotions and low-level frequency emotional states and emotional addictions, with 10% glimpses into peace, serenity, and bliss. 2 questions for you to consider. Oh, false advertisement. Only 1 question, not 2. My bad. If how I think and feel produces a state of being that influences every atom in my world, what am I broadcasting, consciously or unconsciously, in this moment and every other moment? So now we're equipped with all of that knowledge. Let's move into point number 2 and cover the most important details of how your thought and feeling loops manifest. Sorry. Okay, point number 2, how your thought feeling loops manifest. By the way, I do apologise for the constant changing of lightness in this room. It's been a struggle. I've put the curtains up now, so it's a little bit darker. I'm moving out of this place soon. I know it's not ideal, but hopefully you appreciate the struggle. Bravo 6, going dark. First of all, there's a few things I want you to note before we go any further into this section. First of all, thoughts are the language of the brain. Feelings are the language of the body. And your mind, when we use that word, your mind is your brain in action. Remember a few segments ago we said, change your mind, change your brain, change your brain, change your mind. Hopefully that sentence illuminates the meaning of that phrase. Now, the main thing to know about how your thoughts and feelings interact is your brain is always monitoring what your body is doing. And then based on the chemical feedback that your brain receives from what your body is doing in the form of feelings and emotions, your brain will spark you to have similar thoughts that correspond to your body's chemical state. In other words, as you feel the way you're thinking, you think the way you're feeling. As you feel the way you're thinking, you think the way you're feeling. In a few seconds' time, we're going to really deep dive into this to highlight how this plays out with mood, temperament, and personality. But the last thing I want you to note before we move on is when we say state of being, what we're talking about is a state of being is your mind plus your body working together in unison. Fundamentally, that is what an identity is. Nothing more than you getting stuck in, for good or worse, consistent thought and feeling loops where they're working together for your brain to spark you to have certain thoughts, which corresponds with how your body is feeling, and the cycle continues playing. Right, okay, let's move on and let's define some technical terms. Interestingly enough, what I learned from the book is, on average, by the age 35, 90% of your behaviour is subconsciously memorised, which is quite scary when you think about it. By age 35, you're nothing more than a memorisation of these thought-feeling loops that, again, for better or for worse, have played out in your life. Let's define some terms. So the main technical terms I would like you to remember is, very simply, a neurotransmitter is a chemical messenger that is sent from the brain to the mind. Remember, the mind is the brain in action. And then neuropeptides are chemical signals that serve as a bridge between the brain and the body that influence how we think. And then hormones are chemicals related to feelings in the body. Speaking of hormones, you've probably seen an image like this to my left and your right of the main hormonal gland sites in our body. So when you think, to give you a simple overview, you think the thought, that then results in a neurotransmitter being released, or many. Then neuropeptides are released that of course influence how we think even further by sending a signal from the brain to the body. And then that corresponds in our body feeling a certain way, all of which confirms the way that we're thinking. Okay, let's go deeper into some more in-depth examples of how this plans out. Now let's cover what happens in an algorithmic sense when you experience something and then your brain and body spark you into thought-feeling loops in response to that experience. But before we cover this graph, so to speak, I want you to remember this sentence. Memorized emotions limit us to recreating the past, and your emotions are the end products of past experiences. That's going to make sense in a second. So, you experience something in your external environment or internally, you think something. Then your brain receives that information through your five senses. Let's say it's an external experience. Then your brain processes that sensory data that it's getting from your five senses, which results in your neurons in your brain changing their structure in a way that reflects this external experience that is happening. That results in chemicals being released, such as neurotransmitters, and then those chemicals that are released become feelings and emotions in your body. Those chemicals then flood the body, and all while this is happening, your brain and your body notices that an internal change has happened in response to this experience, which means that your brain now associates the feelings that are going on internally with this external experience. And it forms a memory based on this association, and it stores that memory in your body. The reason why it would do this is because your brain is an efficiency machine. It wants to make your responses quick and easy in response to certain stimuli. Which means that most of your life and responses to things are an illusion. They're your brain experiencing something, then going back into your past and thinking, okay, the last time we experienced this, what did we then do? What did we then feel? And then it gets you to repeat that emotional or cognitive response. To give you a spicy example here, let's say you're rehearsing a sexual fantasy in your head, or you're imagining it. Your brain then releases neurotransmitters in the gap between your neurons, which wake up certain brain pathways. Then that results in neuropeptides being released. Remember, those neuropeptides are the chemicals that act as a bridge that carry messages from your brain to your body. They're released into your bloodstream and they flood the body, making you feel particular emotions. But more specifically, they travel to the hormonal gland sites in your body. They bind to the cells in those glands, waking up your hormonal system, so it would be your reproductive ones in this context. And physiological response, boom, you've got a stiffy. As a man or as a woman, you got whatever you got. So in that case, the imagination becomes so real, your body is responding to how you're thinking by preparing you for the exact same physiological response you would do if you had that experience out of your brain and in the real world, if you get what I mean. Look, let me give you a real world applicable example here for all of this. Let's take the example of someone who feels chronically guilty. I've drawn a little storyboard for us. So they've created an internal environment where they feel as if everything is their fault and they're a horrible, reprehensible human being. As a consequence of rehearsing this internal thought-feeling loop, whenever they think a guilty thought, I'm worthless, I'm not good enough, what have you, their body releases the chemicals that correspond with that thought-feeling loop to make them feel guilty. So over time, with continuous rehearsing of this thought-feeling pattern, guilt bathing feels normal. This person becomes desensitized to this horrible feeling of hatred towards themselves. Very much like if you lived by an airport, you would gradually become used to the sounds of very loud planes. So don't worry too much about this, but when their cells divide and make daughter cells, those new cells have a higher threshold of guilt that is required to be activated. So over time, this person's body has craved and continues to crave the feeling of guilt because their body has become the mind of guilt. Remember, mind is brain in action. But then one day, out of the blue, This person has an experience with one of their close friends. After apologising for something that was inconsequential, their friend simply says, "Hey man, you don't need to over-apologise all of the time. Apologise if you've done something wrong, but you don't need to apologise for something that you haven't done wrong." And this sparks an epiphany within this person. They've acquired this new knowledge and they reason, "Oh yeah, do you know what? Why do I apologise all of the time? Why do I feel so guilty?" Now, guilt seems to no longer have a place in this person's life. However, even though this person has acquired this new knowledge through their epiphany, their body is now not in unison with how their mind is thinking. Because the body still craves the emotional fix of guilt because it's been rehearsed in this thought-feeling loop for such a long time. So, by distancing themselves from this thought-feeling loop and trying to do away with it, their body has gone into a state of emotional withdrawal. It's as if production in a factory has come to a halt and the body is looking up and saying, "Hey man, what's going on up there? You kept sending us the same part in the factory production setting of guilt, and now you're sending us a new part that we don't know what to do with. Maybe it's happiness or pride, what have you." Yeah, "Hey man, what's going on? We made it more efficient for you so you could just continuously rehearse this feeling loop. What's going on?" Your cells then get together and speak to each other as if to say, "We can't have this. We want that familiar feeling back. Quick, let's send him a short-term message up his spinal cord and make him feel guilty for something." All the while, your hypothalamus, that part of your brain that is responsible for keeping everything in balance and homeostasis, notices that in your body, your chemicals are low. So it responds with, "Revert to the old ways of thinking. We need to get these chemicals back up to baseline." So even though this person, I keep saying it as you, sorry, even though this person has had the epiphany and wanted to break free from their guilt, their body has rebelled after going into a state of withdrawal, resulting in these messages now resonating. This person receives the message that the hypothalamus and the cells have sent, so this person starts to feel guilty again. They start to authorize everything in their life. "Maybe I'm not good after all. Do you know what? Remember what your parents did. That's why you're such a horrible person." Or, "Remember what you did all those years ago. That's why you're such a bad person." And then this person starts to realize it's okay to feel bad. It's not that bad to feel guilty. Returning with, a reaction like that to their previous rehearsed feeling of guilt. So what happens in the final stage is this person experiences a mental amnesia to their initial aim after their epiphany. They forget what they was aiming for after all, which was to finally distance themselves from this feeling of guilt, and they sink back into their rehearsed thought feeling loop because their body went through emotional withdrawal and couldn't stand it. So you might be thinking, "Lewis, that's quite pessimistic. How do we overcome this?" Well, the way you overcome this is you have to actively resist the body's urge to return to your previous thought feeling loops. It does so because, of course, it's more efficient and that pathway has been formed over a long period of time. But first of all, you have to actively resist. And then second of all, this is the most important part, you have to think greater than your internal environment. As Joe Dispenza says, as long as we use familiar feelings as a barometer, as feedback on our efforts to change, we'll always talk ourselves out of greatness. It doesn't have to be guilt. You can apply this example to any change you want to make in your thought feeling loops. What happens is you decide to change, but then chaos ensues between your brain and body because you're no longer doing what you have always rehearsed. So you have to resist falling back into those patterns, which we're going to deep dive into in the next section, and then obviously think greater than your internal environment. But now we're equipped with these examples and some more information. Let's now demystify common terms we hear all of the time, such as mood, temperament, And the big one, personality. What do we mean when we say words like mood, I'm moody, or that's just the way I am, that's my temperament, or that's just my personality? When we're talking about a mood, we're talking about a chemical state of being, as are we talking about this with temperament and personality. However, the difference between these three things is the length at which this chemical state of being lingers. You see, a mood is generally short-term, and it's an expression of a prolonged emotional reaction. Think about it as if there's a delay in the time it is taken for the chemicals that were released that sparked your emotions to be reabsorbed by your body. If that mood lingers, that then becomes a temperament. If that temperament then lingers, that then becomes a personality. To put time frames on this, you can think about a mood in the lens of hours or days that this chemical state of being lasts. However, if this chemical state of being lasts for weeks or months, that then becomes a temperament. If it lasts for years, then that becomes personality. That's just the way I am, so to speak. But what we want to deep dive into now is this personality part, because this is a word that's thrown around a lot. You might feel quite limited to some of your chemical, emotional reactions, and you might have fed the illusion so far, as I have many times in my life, hence I read the book, that you just are the way you are and there's no way you're able to change. So I want to take my hammer of hammer of love and hit you on the head with it and highlight this to you. You see, the word personality is nothing more than a term we use to describe the continuous repetition of a specific thought and feeling loop. Essentially, you become hardwired into a certain way of being. And so your internal habitat or your external habitat becomes your habit. And you continuously produce the same mind, brain in action, because you continuously think and feel the same way, which of course leads into your choices, behaviours and experiences. Remember the loop we covered at the beginning of this video. And so that continuous repetition of a certain level of mind and a way of being creates a mental signature that we then use to conclude with, that's just the way I am, or that's my personality. Whenever someone says, that's just the way I am, what they're saying is, I have rehearsed this way of being for such a long time that it's now difficult for me to enact any other way of being from a new level of mind. So personality is simply a pattern of thinking and feeling. I put times 3,000 to exemplify how rehearsed this thinking and feeling pattern that becomes personality is. And a personality is a direct result of the past emotions that you have rehearsed. So in order to change your personality, you need to change the emotions you memorize. To change your personality, you need to create a new personal reality. You need to observe a new outcome with a new mind. But most people don't change their personality because they stay lower than these three things. Three things, yeah, I got that number right this time. People don't change because they stay lesser than their environment, body and time. We said this a few moments ago when I was given a solution to overcoming barriers to change. I said you must think greater than your internal and external environment to resist your body's addiction to your previous emotional patterns. You have to think greater than your environment. No thing, body, no body, and time, no time. There is a quote that exemplifies all of this by Joe Dispenza. He says, "We're not punished for our sins, that is, our thoughts, feelings and actions, but by them." That encapsulates everything that we just spoke about in the last 5 or 10 minutes. Now we've demystified some common terms like mood, temperament and personality. Let's now demystify what people mean when they're talking about the good old days or they're speaking about the past. That was a bar. We're not punished for our sins, that is our thoughts, feelings and actions, but by them. See, there's quotes like that which, when you read them, you can't unread them. And that exemplifies how understanding is literally 90% of behaviour change. So you might feel up until this point that we haven't spoken about too many things in terms of practicalities of what you can do right now, what protocols and tools you can use. Of course, we can get into that, but hopefully you're understanding that an understanding of all of this stuff is 90% of the solution. The sequence of living in the past is, first of all, you dwell on the memory. And then that releases certain chemicals in your body and your brain. And because the body can't differentiate between a memory and an actual experience, because its currency is feelings, so by you thinking about that past memory and feeling the same thing you felt while that thing was happening, your brain's like, oh, this is actually happening right now in reality. That causes you to literally live in the past. Because if an experience and a memory is exactly the same to your brain, there's no difference between a past and a present experience. So when people say, oh, the good old days or what have you, what they're literally saying is there's nothing worthwhile for me to focus on right now, so I'm just going to sit back and give my brain the illusion that what I'm thinking about that happened in the past is happening right now, so I get those nice chemical feelings. So through this lens, thought is memory plus emotion. Thought is a memorized emotion. Now we've covered that, and just before we move on to the next sequence, which is coherence between your brain waves, let's consider what all of this that we've just covered highlights about the brain. What this highlights about the brain is that your brain is equal to your environment. It's a record of all of your past experiences, and whenever it experiences something new, that triggers your brain to search for old memories so that you can become equal to your environment. So now we know everything we know about thought feeling loops, and to put it quite bluntly, why are you expecting something different to show up in your life when you continuously think, feel and act in the same way? That's a new definition of insanity. And we can also trace all of our, because I'm jointing this, all of our personal shortcomings to the fact we haven't accepted the truth that our thoughts create our personal reality. Unpacking that slightly, you then might think, oh, all I need to do is think positive thoughts. But no, because remember everything we've covered about thought feeling loops. If you just think one way and you don't condition your body to correspond with the appropriate feelings in response to that thought, then your body is going to be out of unison with your mind. So in order to do that and bypass the system, you need to unmemorize an emotion that's become part of your personality, and then you need to recondition the body to a new mind, which we're going to cover in the point about enacting change. So now this section about how your thought feeling loops manifest is done. Before we end, I'm going to leave a question for you to ponder right now on the board. Okay, point number 3, coherence. We're not going to touch on this point in too much detail, but I just want to give you a brief overview of what we're talking about when we've been using this word, or these words, being in alignment, congruence, coherence. What we're talking about is your brain waves. Now, at any point throughout your life, when your brain is active and operating, it is operating from a particular brainwave. We have beta, alpha, theta, and delta. Beta waves is what your brain is operating from most of the time when you're consciously aware. Alpha waves are somewhat the bridge between your conscious and unconscious awareness, and then your unconscious, more coherent waves, higher level, higher frequency thinking, so to speak, are when you're operating from theta or delta waves. Now, it's worth highlighting the downsides of operating from high beta waves most of the time, because operating from high beta sparks your brain into a state of chaos and disorder. This is where you're operating from survival emotions most of the time, where you're engaging in fight or flight. Everything is an emergency, everything is important, or you're externally focused. You're focusing on problems but not solutions. You're worried about how your hair looks, or what your appearance is like, or how little money you have. It's very hard to learn and absorb new information when you're operating from high beta waves most of the time, because your brain is largely stuck in the past as a slave to the thought-feeling loops that you've rehearsed again and again and again. Now, we'll move on, and I'm going to paint a picture on the board of what coherence really looks like in your brain, but I just wanted you to note that theta and delta waves are largely what you experience when you're in a state of deep meditation or you're deeply asleep. We haven't spoken about meditation in this video, largely because I didn't want to say the key to all of this is just sitting down and meditating. Now, there are options for you to delve into if you wanted to look at this behaviour change sequence from the lens of meditation, but I didn't want to get too deep into it because I wanted to give you alternatives to saying you need to sit down and meditate all of the time. What do we mean by coherence? When we say we're aiming for coherence, what we mean is we're aiming for a unison between your brain and your body in a positive direction. For example, coherent brain waves are when you feel loving, you exemplify trust to the universe, you feel whole, you feel clear. However, the analogy for incoherent brain waves is like a badly tuned orchestra. All of the parts of your brain and your body are out of alignment as egotistical, self-serving parts just out for their own interest. However, when you enact the questions that we've been covering so far throughout this video, and we're going to cover some more in the next sequence of Enact Change, you gather awareness of your emotional patterns and you start to become the orchestrator of the orchestra, and you begin to gradually get your instruments playing in alignment for a well-versed musical song. You do the same with meditation as well. What this might also look like from an emotional point of view is this. The goal, as with anything, is to change the equation of you operating from survival emotions 90% of the time, with 10% glimpses into your desired elevated emotions, so it becomes 90% of the time you're operating from your desired elevated emotions, with 10% glimpses into survival emotions, because they're useful every now and then. So now we've finished point 3 of coherence. We're now going to finalise this video with part 4, Enact Change. And we're going to bring all of this information together so that I can leave you with the full understanding of how to practically apply this with tools and questions. Because what you need to do to change your thought-feeling loops is to enter your subconscious mind. About 95% of your behaviour is unconscious. 5% is you operating from an analytical and conscious point of view. So in order to change your subconscious programming, there are 2 things you can do. 1, you can enter the subconscious by entering a meditative trance-like state through meditation, or you can consciously question your subconscious with the right questions and with enough repetition so your conscious awareness gradually becomes programmed into the subconscious. So to get us started, I want you to keep one emotional state you would like to change in mind and answer these questions. We have arrived at point number 4, enact change. Let's finalise this video with some real practicalities. I really appreciate your time and attention thus far. Before you make any change, however, I want to give you a word of warning. Changing yourself in any way is very hard for some people to accept, because if you have shared experiences with someone, that means you've shared emotions. So by changing yourself in any way, and by stepping into new energy and new emotional thought feeling loops, you're breaking your bonds with this other person. So it's very hard for them to accept, because it freaks them out and you're no longer like them. Just wanted to give you that word of warning. There are going to be 5 sub-chapters we're going to cover in this next section. Number 1, gain knowledge. Half of that has already been done, but I just wanted to elaborate one tiny point further as to how this has all worked. 2, we're going to unmemorize past emotions, take new action, memorize that new feeling, and then move what you've learned from consciousness into unconsciousness. But before we get started with a brief explanation on gaining knowledge, so you can utilize it in your own way, let's go back to the garden analogy. Hopefully you remember this beautiful analogy, but just to reiterate what we meant with all of the components. First of all, you sowing the seeds in your garden is you acquiring new knowledge and learning in order to create your new self, which you've done already. The safety net that is around all of the plants and the fruit in the garden is you emotionally rejoicing in this new version of yourself that you're becoming. As to fertilizing the fruit and the plants on the ground is you falling in love with this new version of yourself. You tending to the garden and all of the plants is the daily meditations you do, the rehearsals of your new self you're going to do, and the contemplations that you've been doing throughout this video and you will do throughout your day-to-day life. The creativity you enact in creating a new self is the more diverse fruits you're going to yield in the future. And then lastly, the sunlight. I didn't have an orange or a yellow, sorry, it had to be a red sun. The sunlight and the water that is used in order to grow the plants and the fruit in your garden is your conscious attention and your dreams of the new self you can further morph into. So let's get this process of change really started. First of all, just to finalise this point of gaining new knowledge, which you have done throughout this video, and to give you an even higher incentive to learn and absorb after this video, what happens when you learn new knowledge is your brain acquires the knowledge and it changes its neural networks and pathways to accommodate for this new information, all of which, as we've mentioned, prepares you to take a new experience. And so you take that new experience based on the knowledge you've learned, meaning you now feel new emotions in response to that new experience. And the cool thing to note is that knowledge is for your mind, but experience is for your body. So by creating a new experience based on that knowledge, you're now teaching your body how to feel differently, thus breaking the thought, feeling loop you wanted to overcome. To give you one final example on all of this, the best way to conceptualize this is what happens when you read a new book and really absorb the information. Let's say you have a difficult relationship with your mother-in-law, but one day you read a book on compassion. Okay, so you read the book, you absorb the knowledge, and you're thinking, this would be great to use with my mother-in-law who I always usually argue with. And then you get invited to meet her or see her at a family gathering. But You've imagined how you want to feel differently around her as a consequence of reading this book on compassion. So that has prepared you for a new experience, which is stepping into the feeling of compassion. So you act compassionately around her, and then with rehearsal, each time you meet your mother-in-law, you then begin to connect the feeling of compassion with your mother-in-law, meaning your mind and body have aligned. This has happened to me so many times after reading a book. I remember the main one that happened, or the main way this happened to me, is I read a book called Rapport, The 4 Ways to Read People, which is all about tapping into attentive listening. And after I read the book, everyone who I met was a springboard for me to enact my newfound knowledge into experience of building rapport and connections and a bridge between people. It was incredible. Comment down below the last book you read that prepared you for a new emotional experience that you're still rehearsing to this day. Okay, that is the final point on the importance of gaining new knowledge. Now let's get into point number 2. How to unmemorize an undesired emotion. First of all, you need to begin a life review. But in order to kickstart that review, you need to first identify the problem that you would like to change. Largely, the emotion or emotions you would like to unmemorize. So within the next few minutes in this video, I'm going to include some questions that are going to pop up one by one with a few seconds in between to provide you with some food for thought. However, if you want to skip these questions and save them for yourself to journal for later, then the top pinned comment of this video is going to include all of the notes and questions in this segment. So it's your choice. You can either skip these questions as they're coming on screen and just go to the next section, or answer them in real time. Here they are. And now I want you to choose one emotion, one thought, feeling loop you would like to unmemorize. But don't worry about choosing one at the expense of another one you would like to unmemorize, because perhaps you've noticed already, emotions are linked. Whether it be insecurity, anger, anxiety, frustration, or resentment, just pick one loop you would like to unmemorize. And then, after you've chosen that loop, I want you to observe it. Maybe close your eyes in your own time and actively call that loop or that emotion up to your awareness. Because you likely when the loop sparks within you, try to avoid it by burying yourself and your attention in the external world. But I want you to actively lean into this loop so you can become a master and see what happens when the loop is playing out in your mind and your bodily awareness. And remember that this loop, this emotion you've memorized, it's not the present and it's not the future. It is the past. It is your mind recreating this past memory that it has memorized. As Joe Dispenza says, there's a quote that's relevant here. This emotion has motivated you to appropriate everything you know in your environment to fashion an identity. Because of this feeling, you created an ideal for the world instead of an ideal for yourself. And as long as you live by this emotion daily, you can only think in the past. Remember, this is the mood that you've fallen into that became a temperament that then became a personality. Become so aware of it that it now can no longer slip by your conscious awareness. Choose, observe, and then you define. Then I want you to define the state of mind associated with that emotion. When you're calling this emotion up, it might be quite distressing, obviously, because it's an emotion you want to avoid. However, by leaning into it, you give yourself the opportunity to then lean back from it with fresh observations and understanding. Consider it as if you're at the top of a mountain and you're seeing everything plan out down below with a higher perspective. There are 3 questions I would like you to question of this emotion as you're observing it. How do I think when I feel this way? What's going on up here in correspondence with what's going on down here? What is my attitude when I feel this emotion? Your attitude is the string of thoughts that couple this bodily feeling. It's the neural programming. They're the thoughts you've chosen to believe most often. And then finally, what is the state of mind that is powered by this emotion? The state of mind, it could be neediness, desperation, frustration, resentment, insecurity, fear, anxiety, what have you. What's going on? The more specific you can be with all of this, the better. Remember, all of these questions are going to be down below, so don't worry about missing out on not being able to answer them fully right now. Just want to give you the foundations. Step number 2. I'm going to need you to do something that is a little bit more vulnerable. Okay? Hear me out. I'm going to need you to admit and declare the problem in order to then receive acceptance. In your own time, perhaps you'd like to close your eyes and outwardly admit and inwardly declare who you have been pretending to be, which is in contrast with who you actually are. This isn't me getting woo-woo, but if you believe in a higher power, now is the time to call on the shared responsibility of that force. You might say something such as, I pretend I'm happy, but I'm really suffering because I'm lonely. You're pretending to be happy, but who you are is someone who's feeling very lonely at this moment in time. There's not going to be any loss of love here. There's not going to be any guilt that is going to be thrown onto you by simply admitting that there is something that you would like to change. The whole point of calling upon a higher power here is you want to offload some of the responsibility and the heavy burden of having something that you have up until this point felt as if you cannot change. Develop a relationship with this higher power, however you imagine it to be. It is an extension of yourself after all, so tap into the vastness of it and receive the acceptance and drink from the well of acceptance that it offers you. And then, after you've done that, you then need to surrender. You see, you can't solve a problem with the same level of consciousness you created it from. So too, you cannot create a brand new personality with your old personality. You need to completely let go of it. But you can't do everything alone, because part of the problem up until this point has been you've been trying to control everything with a lack of trust in letting things naturally happen. So in this state, you surrender in trust, clarity, certainty, honesty, sincerity to the universe, whatever you want to call it, to this higher power, whatever that means for you. In order to unmemorize this emotion, you need to offload it onto a source that is greater than yourself. One thing you might like to do here is, if you have your eyes closed while you're doing this, or you're just doing this from a point of contemplation, imagine what your life might look like if this problem and if this emotional feeling loop was completely solved and you never had to face it again and you never had to deal with it again. How might you feel now? What might your life look like? What energy might you have claimed back to now channel towards new creation? Really paint a picture of what might your life look like if this thing didn't exist. Here, to help you with this, because it might seem a bit vague might seem vague just saying give away the trust and surrender. Here is where mantras can be very useful. 2 mantras that I now hold dear are Universal Mind within me. I forgive my worries, anxieties and small-minded concerns, and I give them to you. I trust that you have the mind to resolve them much better than I could. Arrange the parts of my world so that doors open for me. An innate intelligence. I release my suffering and self-pity to you. I have mismanaged my inner thoughts and actions for long enough. I allow you to intervene and provide a greater life in a way that is just right for me. Remember, you cannot solve a problem from the same level of consciousness you were in when you created it. You have to open your mind now to new levels of thinking and perspectives and higher elevated thoughts from a different plane of consciousness. And by tapping into those different planes of consciousness, well, you can much easily do so by reciting mantras such as this. Create them in whatever way you want. Because up until this point, part of the problem has been you've tried to overanalyze everything from that same level of consciousness and micromanage all of the details. It's now time to give away some of that control. But here's the main thing I want you to take from this segment. You see, when it comes to something like gratitude, we're taught the physics of cause and effect. Be grateful for something that you already have or have had in the past. But the question is, in order for your brain to get on your side and rewire itself in accordance to this thing you want, can you give thanks and gratitude for this thing as if you already have it and as if the problem is already solved? Because if you do, your brain, remember, cannot tell the difference between imagination, memory, or real world experience. So by imagining this thing has already happened and the problem is already being solved, your brain will adapt itself in accordance with that. So be grateful, because this thing has already happened, if you get what I mean. Now, the final part of unmemorizing your past self is step 4, dismantling the memory of the old you. Remember, awareness here is the goal. So you do well to write up a list, keep a little document readily available of all of the characteristics that you're aware of that your old self engages in. Treat them as if you're observing the urges and cravings. You want to think about, okay, when you're operating from this old self, this emotional thought, feeling loop that you want to change, what is the state of being that this old self engages in? What are the thought patterns? What other emotions are tied to this loop and way of being? What actions do you habitually, or what actions does this old self habitually take? What are the addictive behaviours that play out in response to this old self acting upon the urges and cravings that arise? You want to become so aware, remember, you want to become so aware that this old self cannot slip by into unconsciousness again. Hence, keep a document that you can reread again and again and again. Completely dismantle the memory of the old you. But to make this as applicable as possible, I have one question for you to keep close at hand in those moments of feeling the urge to slip back into the slippery downfall of being your old self. When you notice the thought feeling loop arising again, because it will take time to break it, ask yourself, is this thought true? Or is it just what I think and believe while feeling this way? If I act on this impulse, will it lead me to my desired state in life? You might want to keep that on a post-it note just to ask yourself in those moments of distress. Because remember, especially with these first two sentences, you think the way you're feeling and you feel the way you're thinking. So is this thought true, or is it just what I think and believe while feeling this way? Okay. Remember, awareness is the goal. And the more aware you are of how your old self operates, the more you see it on this document and you read it every single day or every now and then, the more you're going to rise above it and be able to notice in those moments of when your old self is calling upon you to enact its old patterns, so you can stand above it and say, no, I know where this leads. Now we've finished dismantling the memory of the old you. Let's now get into the more positive stuff. Taking new action. Take new action. To create a new mind, you need to think of new ways of being. So now we've highlighted the old version of yourself that you now become aware of and you don't want to fall back into the path of being again. You now open your mind up in a state of wonder, speculation, curiosity, contemplation and possibility to now think, what is the greatest ideal of myself? What would it be like to be? Who in history do I admire? How did they act? Who in my life do I know that feels or does? What might it take to think like? What would I say to myself if I were this person? How would I talk to others? How or who do I want to remind myself to be? These questions are all included in the top pinned comment. Really give yourself time to go through them in as much detail as possible. Open-ended questions are going to be the way that you open yourself into this state of speculation, curiosity and possibility, to morph into this new version of yourself. Because it's not enough to just unmemorize, you now need to memorize. And by memorizing this new version of yourself, you step into the rehearsal of creating those new brain pathways. So your brain now not only becomes prepared for this experience, but starts to wire itself into becoming this way of being before you've even done anything. Think about it as if you're installing a new software for your brain to operate from, purely from your imagination. The questions, though, contain three aspects in relation to creating a new personality. Remember, your personality is based on how you think, how you act, and how you feel. So open your mind to these new possibilities. How would my ideal think? What thoughts do I want to put my energy behind? What is my new attitude? Remember, your attitude is those thoughts you have chosen to think most frequently. How do I want to perceive myself? What do I want to believe about me? What would I say to, or what would I say to myself if I were this person? How would my ideal act? What would they do? how would I speak as this new ideal? How would I see myself act? And then how would the new self be? What would my energy feel like as this new ideal? What would I feel? Okay, now we've got two final points. So now you've unmemorized the thought feeling loops from your emotionally addicted past self. You now utilize that liberated emotional energy and channel it towards memorizing the new feelings from the new actions you take as you step in to your new self. This ability to step into your new self will come as a consequence of the answers you found to the questions we covered in the last segment, where you opened your mind to the states of possibility, wonder and curiosity and creation of who you could be. But note, it takes continuous repetition in the form of frequency, intensity and duration to practice being this new self and rehearse it so much that it comes away from conscious awareness and gets installed into your unconsciousness, where it just becomes an automatic way of being. So too, it takes frequency, intensity and duration to avoid slipping into the comfortable loop of being your past self. But you're going to be aided to not fall into that slippery slope with the awareness that you have uncovered in the previous questions we covered. The analogy here is when you're learning a new instrument or a brand new language, you're going to have to continuously repeat the practice of that new skill until it becomes fully ingrained. So it will take these three components for it to become normal. But as we bring this video to a close, there is one key tool I want to equip you with so you can avoid slipping back into the comfortable slope of being your old self. The loudest word I want to be in your brain is the word change. Whenever you're going about your day-to-day life, or you catch yourself in a moment where you're slipping into the comfortable attitude of your past self and that thought feeling loop is beginning to manifest that you want to move away from, or you're about to act on an impulse or an urge that is no longer desirable and in alignment with your ideal self, say the word change out loud or to yourself in your head. Use it as a cognitive tool to signal to yourself something is about to happen that is bad, that I no longer want to fall into. Now is an opportunity for me to bring awareness to the table and then redirect my energy away from this. You can then say, this is not loving to me. The rewards of being happy, healthy and loving are much more important than being stuck in the same self-destructive pattern. I don't want to emotionally signal my genes and body in the same adverse way. That's not worth it. This will be a saving grace for you in those moments of temptation. Okay, now with that part being done, I just wanted to highlight how when you unmemorize a previous emotion, when you decouple an emotion from a memory, that memory now becomes wisdom. So by unmemorizing past emotions, you're gifting yourself a lot of wisdom that you can now channel in towards creating a map for the future. Final point. Okay, the last few things I want to leave you with. Even though part 5 is move from consciousness into unconsciousness, your new way of being, we briefly touched on it in the last segment, so I won't elaborate too much further. You get the point. Remember that the whole point of this new way of being is transparency. So how you appear to the external world is who you are on the inside. And most importantly, you no longer rely on external things to make you feel a certain way or to change your internal state. And to change yourself, your way of being, is to change your energy. And that change will result in you emitting new energy in the world. And I want to leave you with two questions. Can you be greater than your present environment that is connected to your past personality, memories, and associations? And have you conditioned your body and moulded your mind to be ahead of the present reality in front of you? If so, then the change has been made. And as a final barometer for whether the change has been made or not, you can tell whether the change has been made because you'll start to feel differently more consistently. In fact, it will become so consistent it might even become boring, your new level of greatness or change that you wanted to make. If you want to go into the daily review aspect of this, then here are some questions you might like to ask at the end of each day, and then I'm going to leave you with a final quote. At the end of each day, you might like to reflect with, how did I do today? When did I fall from grace? And why? Who or what was it I reacted to and where? When did I go unconscious? What can I do better next time that happens? Final quote. When our behaviours match our intentions, when our actions are equal to our thoughts, when our minds and bodies are working together, and when our words and our deeds are aligned, there is an immense power behind any individual. I cannot thank you enough if you have made it this far into the video. This has been recorded over a span of 3 days. It's probably been the longest, it has been the longest video I have recorded yet. If you've made it this far, comment down below an emoji of a wizard. Thank you for your time and attention, your patience and your dedication to absorbing new information. Stay disciplined, playful and dangerous. My name is Luis. Adios muchachos y muchachas.